So let's jump right into a huge question, one that sits at the intersection of philosophy, science, and just our own daily lives. Are we truly free agents in the story of history? Or is something else pulling the strings? To even start to answer that, we have to pull back the curtain on what history itself actually is.
You might know this story. This is the fate of Sisyphus, a character from Greek myth who was a little too clever for his own good and got on the wrong side of the gods. Their punishment for him? An eternity of meaningless work. He has to push a giant boulder up a mountain, and every single time, just as he's about to reach the top, it rolls all the way back down, forever. And you gotta wonder, is this the human story? I mean, think about the daily routine, right? Waking up, working, eating, sleeping, and then you just start all over again. Is this our version of Sisyphus's rock? Are we caught in some big cycle that's determined by forces we can't control? Or do we actually have the power to write our own story?
To begin to unpack that question, we first have to completely tear down our basic idea of what history even means. It's not as simple as you think.
You see, the word history itself has this kind of dual meaning. On the one hand, there's history as the thing that actually happened, the raw, unfiltered reality of the past. But then, there's history as the study of that reality, the story that we tell ourselves about what happened. And it's absolutely crucial to remember that these two things are not the same.
So here's the key takeaway. No historical account is ever a perfect, neutral mirror of the past. It just can't be. It's always a representation, a story, told from a particular point of view. The person telling the story, the historian, is always standing right here in the present, looking back with their own biases, their own questions, their own agenda.
And this becomes crystal clear when you compare two different ways of looking at the past. You've got macro history. This is the grand narrative we all learn in school, the story of kings and wars and empires. But then you have something called microhistory, which digs up the forgotten lives of ordinary people. People like a 16th century miller named Minocchio, who was actually put on trial by the Inquisition for his really unique ideas about the cosmos. His story gives us this totally different window into his time, a perspective that was almost lost forever.
We even structure time itself from a certain point of view. This is the standard timeline of Western history, right? We mark time with these big events like the fall of Rome or the French Revolution. It feels solid, official, almost natural. But the second you ask this question, the whole thing starts to look a lot less universal. This timeline is fundamentally Eurocentric. What about the cultures in China or India or the Americas? They had their own calendars, their own turning points, their own histories that didn't revolve around Europe. So you see, even the way we measure time is a choice. It's a perspective, not an absolute truth. Okay, so if human history is relative and shaped by our perspective, let's just zoom out. I mean, way, way out. Let's talk about the history of, well, everything. Because every story, including ours, needs a setting, right? A when and a where. So what is the ultimate stage for reality itself? Where does it all play out? Right now, our best scientific answer is the Big Bang Theory. This is the idea that the entire universe, all the matter, all the energy, even space and time themselves, exploded into existence from this single impossibly hot and dense point about 13.7 billion years ago. But this is where science kind of hits a wall. As the scientist Evaristo Eduardo de Miranda puts it, asking what came before the Big Bang might actually be a meaningless question. If time itself began with the Big Bang, then there was no before. And at this boundary, physics sort of just stops. And that's where metaphysics, the study of fundamental reality, has to begin. This whole cosmic story completely forced us to rethink the most basic things we thought we knew, starting with space and time.
For hundreds of years, thanks to Isaac Newton, we basically pictured space as this giant, unchanging box. It was the absolute, fixed stage where everything in the universe happened, and time just ticked by at the exact same rate for everyone, everywhere. It was simple, it felt intuitive.
Yeah, turns out it was also wrong. Albert Einstein's theory of relativity completely blew that idea out of the water. He showed us that space and time aren't separate things at all. They're woven together into a single, dynamic, four-dimensional fabric he called spacetime. And this fabric isn't fixed. It can be bent and stretched and warped by matter and energy. And this has a truly mind-bending effect on time. Okay, imagine you're on a time train, and it's always moving forward into the future. Well, Einstein discovered that the faster you move through space, the slower your personal train moves through time.
Now, at our everyday speeds, this effect is so tiny it's basically zero. But if you were an astronaut traveling near the speed of light for what feels like 1 year to you, when you got back to Earth, a whole decade would have passed. Time isn't universal, it's personal.
And this is the secret code to this new reality. E equals mc squared isn't just a famous formula, it's a profound revelation. It tells us that matter and energy are just two different sides of the same coin. A rock, a planet, even you and me, we're all just incredibly condensed energy, woven right into the fabric of space-time.
So, if the stage itself is this warped, relative thing, what does that mean for us, the actors on it? Are we free to improvise our own lines, or is our part already written in the script?
And this brings us right back to that central mystery. Are we really in charge, or are we just products of our time and our culture? Is history the story of a few heroic individuals making choices, or are we all just being guided by these larger collective forces we can't even see?
Well, one very powerful answer comes from Karl Marx and his theory of historical materialism. He argued that who we are, what we believe, even how we think, is fundamentally determined by the material conditions of our lives, how we produce the things we need to survive, like food and shelter. For Marx, history isn't really driven by great ideas or great leaders. It's driven by the evolution of technology and the conflicts between social classes that inevitably arise from it.
So we have these competing theories about history. Some, they emphasize freedom. Others, like Marx's, lean toward determinism. But what if the problem isn't out there in the world? What if the problem is inside our own heads?
The philosopher Immanuel Kant came along with this really radical idea. He said, we can never know reality as it is in itself. We only ever experience the world through the filter of our own minds. And our minds are hardwired with these built-in frameworks, specifically our intuitions of space and time. They aren't things out there in the world. They're the operating system we use to make sense of the world.
And this leads to this really fascinating problem. When our pure reason tries to go beyond the limits of our experience to answer these ultimate questions, it ends up contradicting itself. Kant called these antinomies. For instance, you can construct a perfectly logical argument that the universe must have had a beginning. But you can also construct an equally logical argument that it must be infinite, with no beginning. Pure reason on its own gets stuck. It can't decide.
So where does all this leave us? Are we just trapped by the limits of our own minds, unable to ever know the ultimate truth about history or freedom? Well, not exactly.
You see, the point of Kant's whole project wasn't to kill our search for meaning. It was to kill dogmatism, this idea that we can find one single, absolute, final answer for these massive questions. In a way, he freed us from the pressure of having to have it all figured out. And that brings us all the way back to Sisyphus. Maybe we've been looking at a story all wrong. What if the punishment wasn't the meaningless repetition? What if the struggle itself is the whole point? If we can never know for certain whether we're free or determined, whether history has a grand purpose or is just a series of accidents, then the only thing that really matters is the choice we make in the face of all that uncertainty. The universe might not give our lives a meaning, but we can. So the final question isn't whether the stone will roll back down. It will. The question is, how will you choose to push it?